So I would like to introduce to you Christian Williams, who's going to talk to us about Catherine of Siena.
Catherine of Siena, after Grace talked about medieval people, which is a disservice, I should have went first. That way she could have corrected any wrong things that I said. So, Catherine of Siena, in a letter to Pope Gregory, St. Catherine of Siena writes, "If you are who God made you to be, you will set the world on fire." I first myself became enamored with Catherine the summer of 2017 while in Italy studying medieval art and spirituality. Dr. Glahn gave a brief statement on relics, which intrigued my Protestant imagination with morbid immaturity. But when I stepped into the space, into the church there in Siena, covered in frescoes depicting the life of this woman who is held so dear in the history of the church we all belong to, for the first time I felt the words of whoever wrote Hebrews come to life. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. That's from Hebrews 12. I walked into that church grossly fascinated, and I walked out of that church more in love with Jesus and utterly obsessed with Catherine and her story, so much so that from that point on, I kept asking myself, what would Catherine say about this? Now, before we go any further into this presentation, there's a couple of things that I want to talk about. First, Catherine is a product of her time. Second, Catherine is a product of her time. And third, Catherine is a product of her time. That is to say that mysticism was alive and rampant throughout not just Europe, but much of the known world during this time in church history. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the Western side of church history with this, not the Eastern side. And so some things that are foreign to us, such as the stigmata or extreme fasting and surviving purely on the Eucharist, or even drinking the infected pus of the sick, were rare yet not odd. She did that. It's gross. She didn't know about germs. As we talk about Catherine's theology of divine love and how that spurred her to a deep conviction of ecclesiastical unity, those things matter but should not be the focus and metric by which we judge her writings and teachings. Now, for a little bit of a segue. Not really a segue, but this is what we're going to be talking about. For those of us who live in the time and space in which we live in, and the conversations that we have, and the news cycles that we have, for us, unity looks like two groups divesting of power and coming together in harmonious, perfect relationship and getting along. That's not what unity looked like for Catherine. For Catherine, unity looked like perfect love, or right love, right power, and right authority. Current conversations on the divestment of power, in my opinion, are rooted a lot in white feminism, in the sense that those who are without power get to say, power doesn't matter, and that's how we get along. And if you have never been oppressed, then to you, power obviously doesn't matter. So when we talk about unity, we're going to be talking about right love, right power, right authority. And though we're not going to be talking about some of Catherine's letters about the Crusades, I feel like I would be remiss to say, when I say that Catherine was a product of her time, what I also mean is that some of her letters, specifically her letters to monarchs, popes, and even soldiers regarding military and political action in the Holy Land, advocating for more crusades, are a direct product of her time. We have the liberty of looking back in history to say, probably not a good idea to drink the pus of sick people because of infection and transmitted disease and germs. And also that the Crusades were bad because of what I like to call the 5 Ps of Christendom, which is power, profit, popularity, prestige, and politics. And yet Catherine did good, preached good, and lived good. And the good we are here to talk about is how for Catherine, the divine love of God compels us towards this unity. Right love, right power, right authority. So this is what our time together is going to look like. A quick biographical, I say quick, anybody who knows me knows that quick means something different. A quick biographical overview of Catherine's life, Catherine's theology of love, suffering, and unity. A brief French interlude as we look at the Avignon Papal controversy, Catherine's impact on Pope Gregory, and finally her legacy and what we can learn from Catherine today. So, who is Catherine? This woman right here. She's often depicted with the lily. Lilies are a sign of purity. So in April 2022, Femme Catholic, an organization dedicated to the mission of education, encouragement, and empowerment for women, particularly Catholic women, who live at the intersection of feminism or femininity and faith, published a blog article entitled St. Catherine of Siena, the patron saint of women who are too much. And as tongue-in-cheek as it is, I'm quite certain that before Catherine gained any measure of notoriety or attention, her family might have thought so as well. This is why she and I get along so much. Catherine was born in March 1347 in Siena, Italy, to a reasonably wealthy family of 25 children. That's a lot. At the age of 6, Catherine was said to have her first mystical experience, and it was a vision of Christ in papal robes sitting on a throne above her local church or Duomo. And it says, and they're hanging in the air in front of her over the roof of the church of the friars preachers, she saw a most beautiful bridal chamber decked out in regal splendor, in which on the imperial throne, dressed in pontifical attire, with a tiara on his head, sat the Lord Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. Then gazing straight at her with eyes full of majesty and smiling most lovingly, he raised his right hand over her, made the sign of the cross of salvation like a priest, and graciously gave her his eternal benediction. In response to her divine experience, she reportedly pledged her virginity to Christ at the age of 7, and it was this sort of act of dedication to God that would mark Catherine for the rest of her life. This was the beginning of a life devoted to God, devoted to the church, and the beginning of a spirituality understood and developed by knowledge gained through mystical experience. Now, Catherine had a younger sister who died in childbirth, and her parents were like, you should marry her widower. That is the correct term for a male widow. Am I correct? Yes. And Catherine, who just lost a sister who died in childbirth and was looking at her brother-in-law and was like, that's not for me. So at the age of 15, she took a bold stance and cut off all her hair. You can imagine her mother's shock. It was an act of defiance against her parents' desire to see her marry, and her commitment to remaining celibate in congruence with her earlier pledging of virginity to Christ as a child was the beginning of Catherine's own self-actualization and theologizing. Thus, she embarked on a life marked by penance, asceticism, and prayer. Intrigued by a life devoted to God, Catherine was drawn to the Dominican Third Order's Mannelite Sisters, a group of lay women, mostly widows who wore the Dominican habit but continued to reside at their homes and their communities. So Catherine was not a nun, she was a lay woman, which I think is utterly fascinating because there exists a hierarchy in Protestant churches where people who are the clergy of the highest order. And Catherine is a clear example of the importance of lay people. So, the Third Order of St. Dominic was founded by a group of pious lay people who found value in the teachings of St. Dominic, which situated heavily on penance. In 1285, this collective established its own rule, the Third Order of Penance of St. Dominic, and was officially recognized by the Church in 1286. And 4 crucial tenets to the rule are: 1, the subjugation or submission of the Third Order to ecclesiastical authority, aka the Pope and the Church. 2, a deep passion for the Catholic Church, or the Church Catholic, because there was no Protestants at this time, and community neighbor care for the sick, poor, etc., and 4, prayer. As a member of the Dominican Third Order, these 4 crucial tenets were a pillar throughout Catherine's life, with her refusal to marry and in practice of penance, instituting a severe diet of bread, raw vegetables, and water. Here is a spoiler alert. Catherine died of physical injuries related to malnutrition. Following the death of her youngest sister, tension began to rise in Catherine's childhood home, and Catherine's rejection of her parents' desire to marry, to see her fulfill the social construct of Sienese society by cutting off her hair and not marrying, thus rejecting societal constructs of her own femininity while playing into the role of an acceptable alternative, ergo, the virgin belonging to God and dedicated to the church, seemed to be a point of contention. Sorry, I'm getting excited. So, Catherine. This is an empty slide. Okay, medieval female mysticism. Now, this is a brief interlude, which I feel like I would be remiss to say, because Catherine was considered a mystic. Medieval mysticism was ripe, as I said, but I think there's something to be said when we talk about right love, right authority, and right and power that is embodied in medieval female mysticism. So here at the left, we have Bernini's statue of St. Teresa of Avila, which is in Spain in her ecstasy. This is Claire Assisi, who we heard about earlier today. And this is Catherine holding a crucified Jesus, and see, she bears the stigmata here just like he does. So, As striking as a figure as she is, she did not exist in isolation. Catherine was born into a world of Christendom, and she was raised in a world of monasticism and mysticism. Today, monasticism exists as a striking paradox. It is at best unheard of, especially for those in mainstream evangelical Protestant traditions, or a vague and abstract reality that is remnant of times long past. Yet it remains a vocation that is alive and well, and the routine, the worship, the daily labor, the layout of the grounds, the study, the discipline, and the practice of meditation hallmarks monasticism. Okay? Now, monasticism itself was born out of rejection of the popularization of Christianity under its newfound legality and the cultural societal perks which followed. The interweaving of faith, power, and politics gave rise to a collective group who sought to return to the discipleship practices of the early church for those who lived under persecution and the martyrs who died for their faith. For this community, sacrifice and divestment of power for the sake of a life devoted to God was at the heart of what it meant to be a follower of Christ and intrinsically belong to the church. From this group came alternative communities of what was now countercultural minorities, steeped in a rhythm of prayer and labor and topped with catechismal instruction and theological conversation. Peaking during the medieval period, monasticism offered to the world, or at least the world as it was known to Christendom Europe, a sense of sacred time. Every day was consecrated to God, and all work, sacred and secular, were to God and for God. And this idea of sacred time is demonstrated in the Christianization of the calendar, which formed the liturgical seasons of the church and set into standard the daily rhythms of medieval life, in which time was marked by praying of the hours and corporate mass. For an institution which is rooted in and perhaps prides itself on structure, the monastic movement and the monastic traditions would follow would seem at odds with mysticism. Monasticism and mysticism seem to be mutually exclusive. However, in a study of Christian spirituality and historic practices, these two distinct streams of spiritual formation and practice are interwoven, if not mutually inclusive. However, mysticism does not negate the rigidity of monasticism, even if mysticism, and especially Christian mysticism, is a term rife with mystery. Now, Christian mysticism is a sort of experiential theologizing, which manifests itself in diverse ways. Mysticism is a term and concept developed in the early beginnings of the church and derived from Greek terms to explain the experiential interaction with the hidden meaning or gems of the biblical text. Now, why this matters is because if monasticism is about learning of who God is and implementing that knowledge into your daily rhythms, mysticism is about experiencing who God is. And as such, for women, it takes on the ability for them to take on agency and power because their experience of God can upend the power systems of knowledge and learning of who God is. Does that make sense? Okay, so mysticism develops as a theological stream to commune with and know God. And monasticism and mysticism are both spiritually formative practices and traditions. They do not negate each other. Okay? In fact, they in equal manner stand alone while simultaneously informing one another. One tradition removes itself from the corruption which can come with the enculturation to most know God, which we're going to talk about with the evening of popes. And one tradition gives rise to experiential phenomenon to most know God. I think this is why it tracks with women, because there is no greater experience of knowing God than giving birth. Or dying in childbirth, as a lot of women did. And it is into the world of both traditions, the monasticism and mystical, that Catherine is born. So, additionally, there was a feminine explosion in Christian mysticism in the 13th and 14th centuries, possibly due to the building up of lay orders like the Third Order of St. Dominic, and the subsequent or consequent secularization and democratization it allowed for. Female mystics struggled with the role of women in ecclesiastical authority, something Catherine herself would wrestle with while traveling and preaching. Female mystics often pursued knowledge of God with a love madness. It kind of gives rise to this idea of God as a love-drunk pursuer of his people. There was a rapid occurrence of somatic phenomena, including visions and ecstasies, and a prevalence of severe penitential practices like fasting and things like that. Knowing the operational beliefs and practice of these women, it is of no surprise at the age of 19, a year following Catherine's self-imposed isolation, so she sequestered in her house for 3 years, she also started giving her parents stuff away, which probably did not endear her to them. Can you imagine being like Catherine's mom and then come home and being like, where's my stuff? And she's like, I gave it to the poor. Anyway, so at the age of 19, a year following Catherine's self-imposed isolation, in her efforts to imitate Christ, realizing her life, Catherine experienced a mystical marriage with Christ. It is recorded that while she was praying, Jesus appeared to her along with the Virgin Mary, John the Evangelist, St. Paul, St. Dominic, and King David, so all the big hitters. And Jesus placed on her finger a gold ring with pearls and a diamond, saying, there, I marry you to me in faith, to me, your creator and savior. So Catherine was taking the bride of Christ part very seriously. For Catherine, her mystical marriage or espousal to Christ is a union which glorifies God and benefits both her and the church while illuminating specifically theology of John. This type of union is a flooding love drunkenness with the blood of Christ and a passionate inflammation of divine love which pours itself out into the church. The mystical marriage is not just between Christ and his bride, who in this case is the female saint, standing as an individual personification of the church, but a mystical union between the bride, God, and the surrounding world, which is thricely created, sustained, and loved by God. And for Catherine, a mystical marriage is the ultimate fulfillment of the Gospels. Okay. I'm trying to keep track of time because we're like running behind schedule. I just want to make sure that that I get everybody out here on time. Okay, I lost my spot. Okay, contemporary thinkers such as Luce Irigaray, who's a French philosopher, feminist, cultural theorist, and linguist, makes claim on this sort of erotic speaking as an expressive subversion of patriarchal and misogynistic authority for the purpose of attaining liberation from societal constructs and experiencing the freedom of sexuality, while others, such as medieval scholars like Carolyn Bynum, assert that mystical marriage and other forms of somatic phenomenon and penance practice ascribed to female mystics like Catherine as a means of imitating Christ, born out of an exclusion by their male counterparts from apostolic and ecclesiastical authority. Neither of these positions may have been an articulated or subconscious option or understanding for Catherine, but what is clear is that somatic mystic phenomena, specifically espouses to Christ, held a purpose significant for Catherine's soteriology and her ecclesiology, and this purpose was intercession. Okay, so for instance, Romans 8, which says, what then are we to say these things? If God is for us, who is against us, so forth and so forth and so on. For I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation which will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. This passage is at the crux of Catherine's life, due mainly in part to the statements it makes regarding, 1, Christ as intercessor, 2, the inseparable nature of God's love, which is made manifest in the love of the Godhead for humankind by the Father, not sparing the Son's obedience even to death on the cross, and the indwelling of the Spirit. Through her mystical marriage, God revealed to Catherine the knowledge of the mystery, which is intercession. In the same way that Christ makes intercession for humankind, Catherine, now one with God because of her espousal, has a responsibility to intercede for the world through weeping and constant humble prayer. In fact, it was God's desire for Catherine to pray for others so that they might receive mercy from him. So why does this matter? What did Catherine teach? Truth, love, and reconciliation. So remember when I first started, I said that for Catherine, unity was right love, right authority, and right power. So we're going to talk about that. In prayer, Catherine discovered intercession not as a devotional act, but a command from God to those who are in intimate relationship with him. For those who are inflamed, notice we're losing all this passionate love language, who are inflamed with the love of God, there is a burden of love for the rest of humanity. It is born from God and it is birthed back to God. Therefore, an individual is compelled from a deep urgency within themselves to seek the mercy of God for those whom they are burdened to love. And it is only through intercession that these persons can obtain divine mercy and experience their own intimate oneness with God. In this oneness, a person becomes more like God. And like God, one is never released from divine love. The divine love that a person comes to know by being united with God and interceding for others is inseparable. Like Paul said, inseparable by death, life, angels, rulers, things present or things to come, powers, height, depth, or anything in all of creation. It is love that is inseparable and never fleeting, and Catherine is united to both God and her fellow human through love, and that love is expressed through constant intercessory prayer. This theology of a passionate divine love later developed into her teachings on God as first truth, and that truth being God's mad love for humankind. When I say mad love, I mean two things. Mad is in like, it doesn't make sense and it's reckless, and mad is in like a 90s slang term of excessive. So Catherine has this thing called two wings of divine love. So imagine that humans are a bird with no wings. Not very much of a bird. They can't do bird-like things without two wings. So on one wing, you have God's love for his people, which is phenomenal, right? It is what inspires the gospel, the incarnation, and atonement, and all that kind of things. But still incomplete, because I don't know if you've tried to see a bird fly with just one wing. It doesn't get too far. It doesn't really get off the ground, you know? The second wing is your love for people. And this is what enables the bird to fly, okay? So for Catherine, those of us who have come to experience God's love, we oftentimes think that God wants us to love him back. But the way in which God loved us is that God is not in need of that type of love. God is not without. He does not need us to love him back. He is not begging for our affection. That's not how he operates. So the best way that you can actually respond to God's love is to take the second wing and love people. And that's actually what makes a full human, okay? Is that you have the two wings and that enables you to take flight. That bird metaphor needs some work. But if you got it, you got it. What naturally followed from Catherine's theology concerning intercession was a generous and charitable care for her neighbors, aka drinking the pus. And it was this revelatory knowledge gained from her mystical espousal that drove Catherine out of her sequestering into an active and public life. And immediately Catherine threw herself into the bonds of neighborly care by caring for the ill and the poor. Due to her theology on divine love, she believed that suffering and death from poverty was a result of humankind's selfishness and not practicing the outpouring of God's love. As a recipient and giver of God's love, as a believer in the two wings, Catherine felt compelled to act, and this practice of hospitality was amplified during a famine in Siena in 1370 and an outbreak of plague in 1372. If you've ever been to Siena, you will see incomplete buildings, which indicate that they never really recovered from the Black Death that happened twice in this famine. Catherine extended herself in caring for the hungry and the dying, and it was also during this time of outpouring of hospitable acts of charity that Catherine experienced intense, ecstatic, mystical encounters and increased her already rigorous fasting, so much so that it became difficult for her to eat solid food, and she often vomited her meals. Yeah, doesn't sound great. Like Shala, I also like to eat. Okay. So truth, love, reconciliation. I want you to hold the reconciliation thought when we get to the popes, okay, and the pope situation. I am not anti-pope. I am anti the unholy alliance between church and politics and profit and power, but that's a whole nother conversation that we're not here for. Okay. As a woman who followed the teachings of St. Dominic, penance was an important matter to Catherine. Penance or confession or reconciliation is one of the 7 sacraments of Catholic doctrine. It is through penance that an individual can receive absolution at the hands of a priest for any sins committed against God and their neighbor, and thus become reconciled with their community. Practices of penance that were common during the medieval period include poverty, fasting, waking or sleep deprivation, self-flagellation. The central theme was depriving the body, and thus inducing suffering to the body became both an act of penance and an act of imitating Christ, who in all of his epitome of holiness suffered in the body for the world. Okay, so here's a thought. It's because sometimes Protestants can be anti-Catholic. But folk theology exists in every tradition of Christians. So you have folk theology, and then you have like actual Orthodox theology, right? And some of us are incredibly familiar with the folk theology of penance around Catholicism. So for Catherine, penance would be, if we have the bird and the broken wings, then penance was meant to restore the fracture of the broken wings, okay? So the deprival of my flesh, the eating, the severe fasting, what some people might say, the severe care for the poor, were in a sense were to heal the broken wings. So penance was an act of bringing together your love for the fracture that exists between myself and my neighbor, not necessarily myself and God, okay? So Catherine's wings, remember what we're talking about. Okay. Okay. What did Catherine do? Prayer, silence and solitude, fasting and penance, caring for the sick, poor and marginalized. So this is a painting or depiction of Catherine being plagued by demons. In case you couldn't tell, these are demons. And so there's a story of Catherine basically having visions and being tormented by demons and essentially not caring, in the sense that she felt like these things, prayer, silence, and solitude, fasting, penance, caring for the sick, poor, and marginalized, if it is repairing the divine wings of love, then, and she is a flying bird, then this is irrelevant, okay? So for her, demons were the result of things like lust and greed and avarice and not care for the poor. Not practicing, so the opposites of practicing silence and solitude is to be impulsive and to lack self-control. So these are the things that are holding humanity back, essentially. And these are the counteractives to the demons, which is why you can see she is not bothered by the demons grabbing a hold of her, okay? All right, perfect. All right, here we go. Here are some depictions of Catherine in art. So on this side, we have a panel from Catherine's, it's not Catherine's church. Let me not make Catherine the owner of everything. It is a church in Siena, dedicated to Catherine. Anyway, so this is a story of Catherine. This guy was a criminal on his way to be executed, and so you can see, if you can see, he doesn't have a head, okay? So this is Catherine over here, if you can see with the stigmata, and basically the story goes, she prayed for him, and heaven received his soul, okay? Over here is Catherine receiving, this is Catherine receiving the stigmata. Now, the stigmata being the wounds of Christ, and she reports receiving these, but no one else could see them. Take that to mean what you will. And then this is a depiction of Catherine putting her theology in practice, which this is her clothing the beggar man. Okay. Okay, what did Catherine say? The dialogue. Now, the main source of Catherine's work is the dialogue. Now, the dialogue was dictated to a person. The name is escaping me right now. While Catherine experienced fits is not the right word, bouts of ecstasy. So she basically was having an ecstatic vision, and she was saying something, and then it was being recorded. So this is the main source of her work. And then also some letters, which we're going to talk about in a second. So the dialogue is a written work consisting of a type of anthological collection of Catherine's teachings and her mystical visions. In the dialogue, Catherine has an intimate conversation with God in which she gives 4 treatises. The treatise on divine providence is a disquisition on love and suffering, in which Catherine argues that the soul can only reach perfection through divine love because God's desire for us is to love both him and our neighbors. The treatise on discretion presents the metaphor of Jesus as the bridge between heaven and earth, and the treatise on prayer is a discussion on intercession, something which is central to Catherine's understanding of what it means to love well. And the final treatise on obedience explains why obedience is crucial to Christian living and the rewards of those who obey God. In each of these, Catherine also makes 4 requests. First, that she would be allowed to suffer in place of believers who are sinning. So those who are not following Jesus, Catherine requests to suffer in their place. Second, for God to act and reform the church, which I think we can all feel the pain of. Third, she pleads for mercy for the world. And lastly, she asks for divine providence, but specifically for a certain case that has arisen, which was most likely the Western Schism. And the Western Schism is a conflict between the French and the Italians, rooted in the authoritative seat of the papacy and the state of the church which it resulted in. And these 4 requests are exemplary examples of our own life experiences. Now, interjection. The popes, it would be French. Okay, so when I say the Western Schism, this is what I mean. So, in the southern corner of France, there exists a place called Aquitaine. And Aquitaine was a quaint little duchy in the south of France that eventually launched the conflict between the French and the English in what is known as the 100 Years' War. And this piece of land would exchange between French and English hands over and over and over. Now, Philip the Fair of France was at war with King Edward I, who was also the Duke of Aquitaine in the 1300s. And Philip wanted to use resources from the church the Holy Church, the Church Catholic, to fund his war. And however, Pope Boniface objected and tried to excommunicate the King of France. We can imagine that Philip did not take this well. And he didn't, because Pope Boniface died of injuries sustained in a beating by Italian allies of Philip. So Italian allies of Philip stormed Boniface's residence and beat him, and he died. So Nicola Boccassini, who was of the Dominican order and Italian, became Pope Benedict, but died suddenly and suspiciously just 8 months later. Suddenly and suspiciously is the Middle Age word for saying we think he was poisoned. His successor, we're going to talk about. Keep tracking. I know it's a lot of names. I know it's a lot of history, but just work with me. So Raymond Bertrand de Got was French. He was also the Archbishop of Bordeaux. And the episcopal seat of Bordeaux was in Aquitaine, which though was in France, it technically was English. Because Eleanor of Aquitaine, the Duchess of Aquitaine, was married to King Louis of France, at least until it was annulled 15 years after they got married and 2 kids later. That's typically not the requirements for annulment, but for kings and queens, such rules don't apply. But in May of 1154, Eleanor married King Henry II of England and was crowned queen, meaning that Raymond was subject to the King of England, Edward, but he was a personal close friend of the King of France, Philip. And after all this hullabaloo between the mysterious depths of 2 popes, he was crowned Pope Clement V in November 1305, where he took the name Clement V. And he moved the papacy from Rome to France. A total of 7 popes reigned in Avignon, and the question that surmises is, why does this matter? For those of us who are unfamiliar with Catholicism, the location of the papal seat may seem of very little consequence. However, if a person belongs to a Christian streaming tradition which holds that Christ's church is built on the back of St. Peter, the first pope, who ministered in Rome and was martyred in Rome, then Rome is not just another city. It is the birthplace of the papacy, the holiest of offices, and it is the central seat of life and authority for the church. Additionally, the Avignon papacy was a clear flaunt of political entrants, mainly the French, and the wealth of papacy and royal courts, which would become a major critique of the church, in case you were wondering about the Protestant Reformation. And in fact, it was Catherine's major critique. For Catherine, the Avignon papacy was not just illegitimate. It was an unraveling of ecclesiastical union and authority, a demonstrable hypocrisy born of self-love, lust, and greed, and a threat to both the church's mission in the world and the sanctity of the individual Christian life. And none of these things she could abide. So, I'm wrapping up, I promise. Here is some depictions of Catherine the Church and the politics. So, this is a later portrayal of Catherine meeting with some cardinals in Florence because she has on a nun's habit and she was not a nun. But, you know, look how uninterested she seems in whatever they seem to be talking about. This was quite par for the course for Catherine. In fact, she would often send scathing letters to Florentine elite to be like, so we're not just going to talk about your hypocrisy, so we're not going to talk about your self-interest, so you're not going to actually follow Jesus. Demonstrated by her posture. This is Catherine meeting with Pope Gregory, which we're going to talk about. This is Catherine also meeting with Pope Gregory. And this, my favorite rendition, is Catherine telling Pope Gregory, bro, you are not following Jesus. Get it together. So, the Avignon papacy was a period of 67 years in which 7 popes of French ancestry resided in Avignon, France instead of Rome. Pope Gregory was the last French pope of the Avignon papacy, and Catherine began writing letters to Pope Gregory in the mid-1370s. During this period, all the reigning French popes had strong ties to the French monarchy, because remember, Philip wanted the church to fund his war against the English. That's a big no-no. Churches do not fund wars. That's my own personal opinion. History has a different opinion, but that's what I think. And this is what happened. In Florence decided that they were going to be anti-French. And they got some Italian city-states together, and they launched a war against the papacy called the War of the Eight Saints. And the Pope said to the Florentines, no, 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 and put them under papal interdict, which basically means it barred Florence from any sacraments of the church. So the Florentines were like, hey, we have this woman who's praying for people in the middle of the street, and their souls are being received by God. We should send her to talk to the Pope. So Catherine is appointed an ambassador to Gregory. Now they sent her to say, hey, can you let him give us communion again? And she went there to talk about the fact that the Avignon papacy was disrupting unity because they were not operating in perfect love, right power, and right authority. She found the great wealth and power of the French papal court to be overwhelmingly corrupt. Due to her passionate love for the church, Catherine was unrelenting in her mission to convince Gregory to cease abuses of power within the church and leave Avignon and return the seat of the papacy to Rome. Catherine's desire to see unity within the church resulted in what some people call a political naivety, evident in her letters to Gregory. She often calls him, I don't speak Italian, but she calls him this word that is Italian for father, and reminds him, pointed finger, you are in charge of the garden of Holy Church. Use your authority, you who are in charge of us. Plant fragrant flowers in this garden for us, pastors and administrators who will be true servants of Jesus Christ crucified, who will seek only God's honor and the salvation of souls, who will be fathers to the poor. Catherine arrived in the summer of 1376 for an audience with the Pope, Italy to France, by boat. It's a long way. Her Florentine supporters had their own political interest at heart, but I believe, and historians debate, that Catherine, though overly optimistic and mayhaps a little bit politically naive, also had her own agenda. Whatever was said during that meeting, we may never know. Whether Catherine's beseeching of Gregory had a profound impact or was more of a charming intrigue will never be fully known. But we do know she wrote a total of 14 letters over 3 years, and whether or not Gregory returned to Rome due to Catherine's passion or to protect his own Italian interests, or maybe even a combination of both, will never be fully known. However, what we do know is that 2 months later, in September of 1376, Gregory, ignoring the objections of council, cardinals, and the French, left Avignon to begin the long journey to Rome, while still at war with a coalition of Italian city-states. He arrived in January 1377, but died the following year, a death which launched the Western Schism, a split between the Catholic Church beginning in 1378 and lasted until 1417. And at the center of the fight was papal legitimacy and authority between two papal seats in Avignon and Rome. Catherine attempted to urge her neighbors to lay aside politics, power, and prestige, and end this division, but to no avail. And it was during the early years of the Western Schism, in prolonged multiple periods of ecstasy, that Catherine dictated the dialogue, her treatise on intercession and God's divine love. Lessons in Legacy. I actually like this one. This is from the, if you don't know, the Modern Saints, which is kind of like this fresh take on all the saints. This is a picture of Catherine with her fiery hair and her smirk. I don't know if she was a redhead, but it fits. By January 1380, Catherine's severe diet led her to even refuse water, but she was still able to see herself to daily mass, where she still received Holy Communion. However, by February, she was struck with paralysis, and her pending death seemed to be of no concern, but answer to prayer. It was the ultimate giving and the ultimate union with the Lord. St. Catherine of Siena died on April 29, 1380, at the age of 33. Catherine was canonized by Pope Pius II in 1461. She is venerated across 3 Christian traditions and is one of the 6 patron saints of Europe and one of the 2 patron saints of Italy. Popularly or piously, both her head and a finger reside in a reliquary as part of the Basilica of San Domenico in Siena. Her deep love for the church and her desire to see reformation and unity has earned her a beloved spot in the history of the church. Her fierce passion, coupled with reports and reputation as a mystic, makes her an intriguing figure in the development of Christian spirituality. St. Catherine of Siena was a female mystic who taught that true intimate union with God was achieved through ecstatic experiencing of God's burning, unrelenting love for humankind. That true peace could only be achieved through penance and demonstrating divine love for one's neighbor, and that the concern for all those who belong to the church should be intercession for the soul of their fellow human and unity amongst the body, right love, right power, right authority. An intriguing figure who crafted one of the richest texts of medieval Christian spirituality and intervened in politics for the purpose of advocating for the good of the church, St. Catherine was a woman who believed that love truly conquers all. And for those of you, patron saint, she's the patron saint of fire, firefighters, illness, nurses, miscarriages, eating disorders, sexuality, and parenthetically, political engagement and activism. And these are two of my favorite quotes from her, from the dialogue. This is a letter to John Harkwood. How cruel it is that we who are Christians, members bound together in the body of Holy Church, should be persecuting one another. I feel this deeply. And then my favorite quote from her, and when she said to Pope Gregory, be who God meant you to be, and you will set the world ablaze. All right, that's all. Okay, questions, I guess. Yeah, so two things. Catherine cutting her hair and telling her family that she was like not going to be the typical Sienese woman is a story I resonate with deeply. The first time I cut my hair, my mother quoted 1 Peter to me and told me that a woman's hair was her crowning glory. And I was like, I don't think that means what you think it means, but I'm not sure what it means, but I don't feel like it's that. And so I live in, so the standard for like American Protestantism and American evangelicalism is white, upper middle class, straight, heteronormative male. And oftentimes that is equated to who God is. And so if you can never be those things, which as a Black, unmarried, no kids, female, who has not bought into the idea of gender essentialism or heteronormativity, then the question is like, can I not be like Jesus then? And so Catherine and her like, I'm going to cut my hair and I'm not going to get married and I'm going to go out here and I'm going to care for the poor, really, really spoke to me. And also part of my life story is like all the things that she's a patron saint of I have experienced. And so I'm intrinsically drawn to her. Okay. All right. Well, if there are no more questions. Wait, okay, go ahead.
Do we know what is being said on this picture here?
Oh, no, I don't know. No. Yeah. My Greek is terrible. And I think that's what that is. I don't even know. That's a great question. Boom. There you go. Okay. All right.